Today we're discussing Justinian I. He was the best known of all the Byzantine emperors. He ruled from 527 to 565, and usually historians look at him as being the last Roman and first Byzantine emperor, although that distinction is more or less a meaningless word game. Some people have tried to claim Constantine as the first Byzantine emperor. Other people have named figures as late as Heraclius. It's really just a matter of semantics and opinion. However, Justinian is the most common person to get that nod. So let's talk about his lifetimes, his domestic affairs, and the people around him who made it all happen. Part of the reason why Justinian remains a very well-known figure in history is that his exploits were recorded by one of the greatest historians of the Middle Ages, Procopius of Caesarea. Procopius was a secretary for General Belisarius from 527 to 540. He then became a Byzantine senator, lived at least another 15 years, and under the patronage of Justinian, he wrote a couple of official works. One is called The History of the Wars. It was technically several different books about each war that Justinian initiated. So one was on the war in Africa, one was on the war in Italy. He also had some books about the wars against the Persians. So most of our information comes from him, and he dedicated this work to Justinian. However, Justinian is very much a background player, and usually the narrative focuses on Belisarius and the field commanders. He also wrote an official work called On Buildings, and this one praises Justinian profusely. It talks about the magnificence of his vision and his generosity, and it gives us a great description of what the Hagia Sophia looked like when it was in its prime and all the ornaments and things were in place. However, Procopius also wrote another work called The Secret History, which came at the end of his life when he was pretty bitter and had plenty of axes to grind. Now, his style in general, especially in the history of the wars, that he's very much a classical Greek style historian. He sets a Byzantine precedent for more or less trying to be a latter-day Thucydides. Pretty much all Byzantine historians after him will try this as well. Procopius, his true opinions are reflected in The Secret History, and we see someone who's extremely disillusioned with Justinian and his administration. Now, one thought that a lot of people have had is that we do know for a fact that there was a lot of elite prejudice against Justinian, who shares the fairly humble origins of his uncle Justin. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And that some people from the older nobility really resented him for being able to exercise power over them. It's also been argued by a well-known Procopius scholar who actually works here at OSU in the classics department, Anthony Caldelis, that Procopius is actually a closet pagan, and that part of his resentment against Justinian is because Justinian was a fairly devout Christian who may or may not have closed Plato's Academy and took other steps to suppress pagan worship as well. So keep in mind that everything we know about Justinian comes through Procopius, or at least a very big amount of it does. So all of the information we have has a very strong bias. So let's get into Justinian's life now that this caveat has been laid. Like his uncle, Justinian was from a rural part of the Balkans, and he was a native Latin speaker. His hometown is called Teresium. It was a fairly small place in the modern Republic of Macedonia, and presumably, just like his uncle, he left and went to Constantinople as a refugee. Somehow, probably because his uncle or maybe his father had acquired some sort of influence at some point, Justinian was able to acquire a first-rate education, and even though he's a native Latin speaker, he does also speak excellent Greek, and he speaks Greek well enough to be conversant in theology, unlike Constantine. Justinian, as a young man, was fairly hot-blooded. We know that he really gets involved in the circus faction affairs. He's a big fan of the blues. There are two major factions, the blues and the greens, and then two minor factions, the whites and the reds. And he's really into chariot racing. He also gets involved in some other things, like it's possible that he got involved in some of the other sordid affairs that they were involved in. At least that's heavily implied by Procopius, but again, remember who the source is. And we know from a very early age that Justinian was a staunch Orthodox Christian, and certainly by the time he took power, when he was already in his late 30s, his stance in favor of his view of Christianity was very well established. While Justinian was visiting the circus, he met an actress named Theodora, who was supposed to be a very beautiful woman. He fell in love with her, and he was determined to marry her. However, there was a problem. Theodora came from a very lower class background. Her father was a bear keeper, and her mother had remarried another bear keeper and switched from the greens to the blues. So she's someone who has a low reputation, and she's also known as an actress. Now, normally, acting in the ancient and medieval world was pretty much the bottom of the barrel for professions, because there was always an implication of prostitution attached to it. Now, it's not clear whether Theodora was a prostitute or merely an actress. I'm sure there were plenty of people who were, strictly in one camp and didn't venture into prostitution. There's really no way to know. But at any rate, because actresses had such a scandalous reputation, there was a law in place that banned marriage between senators and actresses. Now, Justinian was already a senator. He had held the consulship under his uncle, so he puts pressure on his uncle to pass a law to do away with that rule, and eventually Justin is able to get a law passed where senators are able to marry reformed actresses, so meaning actresses who have given up acting, or reformed prostitutes. Now, Theodora was a very intelligent and strong-willed figure. She will be a big part of Justinian's early reign, and someone who was constantly advising him and who helped introduce him to other important people. And interestingly enough, she was a Monophysite Christian. She was not an Orthodox Christian. But because they had a very strong relationship, her influence on Justinian meant that Justinian, even after her death, did not really go after Monophysites, because he respected her and decided that was an acceptable thing. So it's kind of odd that two people with such strong wills and strong opinions could live together in harmony, and it's a very interesting historical partnership. There have been a couple books written about it by Robert Browning, the historian. So first up in the list of people who were a major part of Justinian's administration is his general Belisarius. He has a similar ethnic background to Justinian, and probably rose through the ranks in a similar way, except that his uncle was a lot less famous. Now, he marries a much older woman named Antonina, who is pretty similar to Theodora, and their marriage relationship is also pretty comparable, with both of these women taking a very strong role in the marriage, and in both cases, the wives are older than the husband. However, the age gap between Antonina and Belisarius is much bigger than that between Justinian and Theodora. Belisarius comes to the notice of Justin and Justinian while he is serving as a young officer, and he's someone who has ideas. Now, that's not a very common thing in the ancient or medieval world, to have some junior officer who has ideas about how to actually make things better. So the one thing that Belisarius comes up with is called the Bucellari. These are heavy cavalry who have lances and then composite bows like the Huns had. So they're units that are great at both close quarters engagements like the Avars and long distance engagements like the Huns. And this will become a standard unit of the Byzantine army in due time, and units like this will be part of Belisarius' armies when he is trying to conquer lands in the name of Justinian later. Belisarius is an active commander for about 29 or 30 years. He starts out in 530 with the first Persian crisis that Justinian inherits, and he is then recalled from retirement in 559 to beat back an attack on Constantinople itself. He actually gets tried and convicted for corruption in the year 562, but he never suffers any actual consequences because Justinian pardoned him almost immediately. And despite the fact that Justinian clearly pardoned him, There is a legend that was spread later that Belisarius had lost everything in that trial and that he ended his life as a blind old man begging on the streets, and that one of his soldiers took pity on him and gave him alms. However, it's simply not true. Belisarius died as a rich guy because Justinian pardoned him and made sure that he didn't suffer for the charges that had been leveled against him. So let's talk about Antonina, who is one of the most fascinating figures from this period. She's the wife of Belisarius, and as I mentioned, she's older, and not only a little older, but a lot older. She's 20 years older than Belisarius, and she'd been married at least once before, possibly twice. Her social background is pretty similar to Theodora. It seems like she was probably involved with the circus factions in some way before her beauty was noticed by someone and she was taken up by some rich guy as a wife. She's smeared by Procopius, who basically just says that she was domineering and made life miserable for Belisarius. And as is the case with any smear of a woman in ancient, medieval, or even early modern times, you have to insinuate that she was a sexual deviant. That's just kind of something that you have to throw in there just for good measure. Now, interestingly enough, she actually is a campaign wife. She goes with Belisarius on campaign, and she does some important things. She was a pretty intelligent person and pretty resourceful. So on one campaign, when Belisarius is crossing to Italy, his water supply gets contaminated except for the supply that Antonina had put in jars and sealed. So they do have just enough water to get to their destination and get more. So she does come in handy plenty of times, and there are a few other times where she serves as like an unofficial emissary and does some other stuff. So she's a pretty durable and multi-role kind of person. Now, she also was more or less a very close political ally and pawn of Theodora, and in some ways she was kind of the political general of Theodora in the way that Belisarius was the military general of Justinian. So when Theodora was feuding with John the Cappadocian, she sends Antonina out to basically honeypot John by getting him to talk trash about Justinian and having witnesses overhear it. Now, Antonina supposedly has an affair with Belisarius' grandson, and this apparently was a major scandal at the time, and it's certainly something that Procopius was, really outraged by. However, that eventually blew over, and the two remained married. And we know that she was very active as an old lady, even after Belisarius, who was much younger, had retired. We know that she's traveling around quite a bit, and we know that she's still alive in 565 when both Justinian and Belisarius die. In this picture, this mosaic, Theodora is the figure in the center, and the woman off to her left, who's a little bit shorter, is Antonina. I assume the guy to the right is Pavel Chekhov in one of the original series missions where they traveled back in time. Maybe he just got kind of caught in the moment and had to stand there, didn't know what to do. I don't know. Justinian also had a first-rate bureaucrat on his team. He had John the Cappadocian, another political outsider who had risen to prominence in recent years, and Justinian elevates him to the office of Praetorian Prefect, which he'll hold until 541, in which capacity he's able to really affect tax policy and make sure that things go according to plan. Now, John is famous for introducing new taxes, and his main thing he does, though, is to close tax loopholes for the rich and prevent them from getting out of paying. That's a problem that has always existed. It's not a new thing. And this is a way to produce revenue because Justinian spends a lot of money, both in building stuff and fighting wars. And, in the ancient world, there's no deficit spending. You either have money or you don't. And it's a very literal money. It's, a big pile of metal coins. So you have to be able to collect this money. Because of this, and because he's basically a taxman, John the Cappadocian is deeply unpopular. He also runs into trouble because he's a political rival of Theodora, and he and Theodora are often competing to get Justinian's ear on political affairs, and it seems like they're always at odds. So eventually Theodora comes up with a plan to have Antonina meet John and be overheard by other officials, and it makes it look like he's plotting against Justinian. So then he loses favor. He's in exile for several years in Egypt. He's forced to become a priest, and then Justinian allows him to come home after Theodora dies. But John remains just a sort of low-level priest, and he's never allowed back into administration, despite the fact that he attempts many comebacks. And if I had to explain him in one picture, I would just say that he is the Cyril Figgis of the 6th century. Now, naturally, given how many wars Justinian fought, he needed more than one general, and he had a different general. His other general, at least other famous general, is named Narses. And he is actually interesting because he's a eunuch who was originally from Armenia. So, not what you expected. Certainly a very different guy. And he was also a bit older than Justinian and the other people in that circle. So he was probably a solid 10 to 15 years older than any of them. During those periods that we'll talk about in the video on Justinian's wars, when Belisarius is not in Italy, Narses will be the commander, and he's actually the guy who was chosen to finish off that war. Narses is described in the historian Agathias, who was basically the successor to Procopius, as being someone who has natural intelligence and adaptability, even though his formal education and oratorical skills were pretty much lacking. And after he won the war in Italy, Narses spent his last years trying to repair the ruins at Rome and fix all the damage that all of the various sieges and counter sieges and sacks had done over the last 20 or so years of the Gothic War. And Narses, I think the obvious comparison is to Grey Worm from Game of Thrones. He's a eunuch general who is highly trusted. However, one thing I find odd about this picture, which is traditionally assumed to be Narses, is that he has facial hair, and if you know what a eunuch should not have facial hair. But, I'm not an art historian, I'm just pointing out that they're wrong. Earlier I mentioned that the first great challenge Justinian faced was the war with Persia. If you want to learn more about that, see my other video. But for now, let's talk about the Nika Riot, the first challenge that Justinian faced at home. So, Justinian, although he was a huge fan of the circus factions, especially the Blues, was cracking down on violence in the circus because it was spilling over into the streets and creating civil unrest. So, what happened is he actually had 2 leaders hanged, one from the Blues, one from the Greens, and somehow the execution was botched. Possibly the executioner was too big of a sports fan to kill these guys. So those guys got away, and they decided that they needed to riot together to stand up for their rights to be circus factions. So this results in a huge riot involving a large percentage of the population of Constantinople. And Justinian tries, after several days, to negotiate with these guys in the Hippodrome, but they shot him down. When Belisarius comes out with a few troops and tries to intimidate them, they basically defeat them. So now there are local aristocrats and senators who are thinking, hey, this could be my chance to gain more influence and fame because Justinian might be done. So they found Anastasius' nephew and they tried to make him emperor and have him proclaimed by the crowd. Well, Justinian is ready to call it quits and retreat to somewhere else and then maybe try to reclaim the capital at a later date. That's actually a strategy that Zeno did when he was kicked out of the capital by Basiliscus. However, Theodora said that her funeral shroud would be a royal one, that she wasn't going back to being a lower class person and she was going to die in the imperial purple. So Justinian then sent Belisarius in with the army and ordered him to massacre or do whatever he had to do to restore order. And this results in a brutal massacre of the rioters and the deaths of anywhere from 30 to 35,000 people. Obviously, this is close quarters fighting, and once a panic starts among a mob like that, and they're in a tight space, they're not going to be able to get away, but they are going to be there to get cut down. Had they had the element of surprise, or the Belisarius troops had not been had the initiative, then it's possible the rioters would have won this battle because there's only so much you can do in a pre-modern context without means of crowd control like machine guns, tear gas, cameras to see what's going on and plan accordingly. So anyway, Justinian's solution ultimately is to massively restrict the activities of the factions, and he also has the hippodrome closed for 5 years. And it'll take years for these factions to recover, and they won't start to rear their heads again until the reign of the Emperor Maurice. Justinian was nothing if not an opportunist. You can see that if you look at my video on his foreign policy. But here's another great example of how Justinian managed to always make lemonade out of lemons. Now, there had been 2 previous churches called the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, and the second one had been destroyed in the Nika Riots in January of 537. Justinian began building the current building, which is the 3rd church there, by April, but possibly, I've read, by February, so maybe he started even earlier. And this only took 5 years, yet it's a massive church. And he hired 2 of the top intellectuals of his day, Isidore Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles, to complete this work. One was an architect, one was a physicist, so they were pretty, high-ranking guys in terms of the intellectual community. Now, the interior was so large that it took until the reign of Justin II to complete all the mosaics. Many of those mosaics are now lost because of being plundered over time and the iconoclasm controversies that broke out in later Byzantine history, where Christians would turn against the icons as being pagan, basically. Right now, the Hagia Sophia is still officially a museum in Constantinople or Istanbul. It has been that way since the 30s and the reign of Kemal Ataturk. However, there's a lot of pressure from right-wing Islamist groups in Turkey to make it back into a mosque, which is what it was from 1453 until the 30s. So, if you go to Turkey, this is definitely something to check out, and you'll want to check it out while it's still a museum if you, want it to be something that has a lot of historical value. In 541, it looked like Justinian was about at the height of his power. He had built the Hagia Sophia, he had suppressed the circus factions, his generals had conquered Africa and most of Italy. Things were looking up, and then the shoe dropped. So the Bubonic Plague broke out. This is the first outbreak of Bubonic Plague, and this is a disease that is related to the more famous Black Death from the later Middle Ages. One of the characteristics of this disease which distinguishes it from the Black Death is that necrosis of the hand is a major trademark, which means that many of the survivors were basically left crippled. Now, the estimated death toll for the globe was about 25 million people, so about 13% of the global population, and there will be more little outbreaks here and there over the next 2 centuries that claim another 25 million people. So overall, you might think that's not a huge deal when it comes to, sidelining Justinian's career. He doesn't catch the disease himself. But it does hurt urban areas harder. So the Byzantines and the Sasanians, the Persians, are affected a lot more than the powers of the West. So, for instance, the city of Constantinople especially is really victimized by this. And this is also something which will hit army camps. So this really affects Justinian's tax base. He relies on people, producing things and paying taxes, and now he's got 1/3 less people to do that. Not to mention 1/3 fewer people to recruit for his armies. Justinian's ambition went beyond military and construction efforts, however. He also wanted to really rationalize the operations of the state to some extent. So he ordered an update to the Theodosian Code to be overseen by the great jurist Tribonian. However, Tribonian and Justinian, as they started talking about it, decided that the work needed to be bigger. So what they ended up doing is creating the Corpus Juris Civilis, the greatest collection of Roman law ever, and the one that most scholars now consult when they talk about Roman law, even for periods much earlier than this. So the main 3 books of this corpus are written in Latin. Latin is still the official language of the empire in Justinian's time. After him, it will remain the official language for a while, but most day-to-day operations and even state records will, start being kept in Greek. And we see that start in this period because the novellae, basically the collection of laws that have come out in Justinian's own time are now written in Greek. So the last book is written in Greek, and that sort of signals this transition and kind of, shows what is going to happen after Justinian's gone. And this corpus is actually very influential in later European law codes, both medieval and beyond. Roman law is still the basis of most of European law, so the influence of this might go beyond anything else that Justinian was a part of. Let's take a look at how the 6th century Byzantine economy functioned under the leadership of Justinian. So, first of all, we know that there was widespread trade. He was trading as far away as England. England was a place where you could get a lot of tin, and that was something that was harder to get closer to Byzantium. He also worked to improve the grain route from Alexandria, which was one of the things which kept up the large population at Constantinople, and he improved this route by building a granary at the island of Tenedos on the route between the two cities. He also tried to negotiate around Persia to get a silk supply because Persia was charging a lot of money, and this was a luxury that a lot of people really valued at this time. In the early 550s, some Christian monks managed to smuggle some silkworms from, I believe, China or some other area all the way back to Byzantine territory, since Justinian set up a state industry for making silk. We also know that he was doing business with India. There's a Justinian coin, the one on your right that's pictured there, that was found in India itself. We also know that because of the reforms of John the Cappadocian, that annual revenue went from 5 million solidi to 6 million solidi, so a pretty substantial increase in revenue by the guy who closed tax loopholes and did other things. But despite all of this, there was still a shortage of money because of the expenses that Justinian was incurring. And after 540, he actually has to cut back on the postal service pretty severely. And now there's only really one route running that goes from Constantinople to the eastern frontier, where he has to talk to his generals and also negotiate with the Persians constantly. Let's talk briefly about city populations. Justinian was at the tail end of the time when the Byzantine Empire was urbanized and had several large cities in it. One of the cities that he did not get to control for long as a major center was Rome. Now, this chart is very pessimistic about Rome's population numbers. There's no way that Rome had only like a few thousand people in the year 300 or 400. That's just complete and total nonsense. And also their figure for the year 500 is pretty low. Rome was definitely not the city it had once been with 1.5 million people, but it still had probably a solid 500,000 people going into the year 500. It was still a pretty substantial place. And after the wars between Justinian's generals and the Ostrogoths, however, where the city of Rome changed hands and had endured many sieges that involved the cutting of aqueducts to force a surrender and other things, the city of Rome just wasn't the same. And the repairs that Narses made were not sufficient to get the city's infrastructure back into shape to sustain a large population. After the end of the Gothic Wars, also, the city of Rome would mostly fall under the jurisdiction of the Pope, and for the most part, popes were not interested in repairing the city of Rome. They were only interested in building their own buildings and advancing their own interest. So, the city of Rome was largely left to decay. Part of this is because if you're a pope, you know the danger of potential mob violence, so you want Rome to be a ghost town. That way, you're less likely to have a flash mob show up and have, the Nika Riot of the West. By the time of Justinian, it was well established that Byzantine emperors were the head of their church in the East, and that they were the chief negotiators with the popes and the chief drivers of church councils. However, Justinian really takes this to a whole different level because he is so well versed in theology, and he is basically a very, very devout religious person. So this is something that is of immense importance to him, and I don't know if I've mentioned it yet, but Justinian was actually a workaholic. He really enjoyed staying up all night working on the problems of religion and the state. That's part of what Procopius even says about him in the Secret History. So anyway, one of Justinian's major offensives is in 529. This is basically his religious reform movement year. He tries a bunch of different stuff this year. One thing he tries is he really wants to get rid of pagans in his empire. We see that pagans must still be a pretty sizable minority at this time, because Justinian takes the time to ban them from imperial service and prevent them from teaching. And many people have speculated that this legislation in 529 is what led to the closure of Plato's Academy, which at this point had been going strong for about 1,000 years. So this is considered to be one of the great crimes of Justinian. However, it's not 100% certain if this was the event which closed the Academy. We just know that at some point in the 6th century it closed, and this seems like the most likely time. We also know that some of the professors at the Academy were deeply offended by this measure, and the measure against pagan teachers, and they fled to Persia. And then when there was a treaty in 532 that they were restored to Byzantium and allowed to practice their religion freely. So Justinian did back off on this persecution of pagans. And another group he went after were the Samaritans the same year. These are basically an offshoot of the Jewish faith, where they only regard the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, as being legitimate and the Word of God. So Justinian suppressed them by force, more or less, and hunted them down in Judea. That was actually at the urging of the Jews, the mainstream Jews. And he also had plans for the mainstream Jews, so he put down the Samaritans for them, and in exchange he really wanted them to give up their Hebrew Old Testaments and adopt the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation. And he was arguing that the Greek was actually more accurate, a more accurate representation of the original than the current Hebrew copies. I don't think that they have bit on that particular offer, but Justinian did try. Now, he also had an ambition, since he had agreed to not suppress the Monophysites, to try to resolve that schism in another way, but he was never able to pull that off. The Monophysites were simply too strong and too well entrenched to bend to the arguments of Justinian, so that was sort of his religious career in a nutshell. There had definitely been a lot of energy around Justinian early in his career. He had had a large group of friends and supporters. He had had a pretty big agenda for the Byzantine Empire. But by the end of his life, this energy and enthusiasm was really starting to fade, especially after the Bubonic Plague. But I think the real event which probably downed Justinian's spirits and ambition was when his wife Theodora died in 548. And she made him promise on her deathbed that he would not persecute the Monophysites. And for the most part, he honored that agreement for the next 15 or so years of his life. Which again goes to probably proving that Justinian and Theodora had a very real relationship, and that a lot of the attacks from Procopius on that relationship are probably not all that well founded. One thing that I sort of get from Procopius' description of Justinian pacing around is that in his last years he had buried himself in his work, and he's kind of a sad old man. Most of his friends are gone. He's got a lot of tension in his relationship with Belisarius because of the recalls that he did of him due to jealousy. He has trouble sleeping. He's just someone who doesn't really have friends at this point. And also, we know from Procopius that apparently Justinian is two-faced, that he'll be your friend to your face and then order you executed the next day. So he doesn't really have a lot of people he can trust. Things kind of go south for him. He also, at this time, late in his life, his masterpiece, the Hagia Sophia, has a dome collapse in 558. The dome has to be redesigned, and they put in the current dome in 562, which is a bigger dome that sticks out further and is more stable. So that was a setback to one of his, really cherished projects. And as he ages, he's forced to rely increasingly on his family members to help him govern. And the two people he turns to are his two nephews, both of whom are named Justin, and one of whom will become Justin II, the next emperor of Byzantium.